Harvard University and Yale University, America's most prestigious academic institutions, were built on drug money. Not metaphorically, literally. The opium trade that devastated China for over a century provided the foundational wealth that constructed their buildings, endowed their chairs, and established their dominance in American higher education. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The shipping records exist, the family papers survive, the university archives contain detailed correspondence about Chinese opium profits funding American academic expansion. We're talking about hundreds of millions in today's dollars, transferred directly from Chinese addiction to American education. Before we trace how opium money built America's academic elite, you need to understand what the China trade actually was. From 1800 to 1860, American merchants operated a triangular trade system that dwarfed the profits of any other commercial enterprise in human history. Ships departed Boston loaded with silver coins. They sailed to Turkey and India to purchase raw opium. Then they smuggled this opium into China, where addiction had become a national crisis, selling it for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. Finally, they returned to America, where these luxury goods sold for enormous markups. The profit margins were staggering. A single cargo of opium purchased for $20,000 in Turkey could sell for $200,000 in Canton. That's a 1,000% return on investment. Every 6 months. The Russell family of Boston exemplifies exactly how opium profits flowed into American academic institutions. Samuel Russell founded Russell and Company in 1824, which became the largest American opium trading house in China. Russell and Company controlled roughly 60% of all American opium smuggling into China between 1824 and 1840. The company's internal documents, preserved in Harvard's Baker Library, show annual profits exceeding $500,000 by the 1830s. In today's purchasing power, that's over $20 million per year. Samuel Russell used these profits to establish the Russell Trust, which funded multiple academic initiatives, including direct grants to Yale College. His nephew, William Huntington Russell, co-founded Yale's Skull and Bone Society in 1832 using opium profits. The Russell family papers at Yale explicitly reference China trade proceeds, funding university construction projects throughout the 1840s. Warren Delano II, grandfather of future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ran Russell and Company's Canton operations from 1833 to 1846. Delano's personal correspondence, housed in the Roosevelt Presidential Library, details his management of opium smuggling operations that generated over $2 million in profits during his tenure. That's approximately $80 million today. Delano returned to New York in 1846 and immediately began what he called educational philanthropy. His donation records show major gifts to Harvard College, including funding for Delano Hall and multiple professorships. A letter from Delano to Harvard President Edward Everett, dated March 15, 1847, states explicitly, "These funds derive from our China enterprise and should support the advancement of American learning." The Delano family continued this pattern for generations. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's political career was partially funded by inherited opium wealth that his grandfather had systematically transferred from Chinese addiction to American institutions. John Murray Forbes exemplifies how opium fortunes created entire industrial dynasties that shaped American development. Forbes joined Russell and Company in 1830 and managed their most profitable opium routes between India and Canton. Company ledgers show Forbes personally cleared over $1 million in commissions between 1830 and 1837. He returned to Boston and invested these proceeds in railroad construction, founding the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. But Forbes also systematically donated opium profits to Harvard University. His donation records, maintained in Harvard's archives, show over $300,000 in gifts between 1840 and 1860. These donations funded the Forbes Library construction, multiple science buildings, and established the Forbes Chair in Natural History. Forbes explicitly wrote to Harvard administrators that his China trade success enabled these educational investments. The Forbes family continued this philanthropy pattern for over a century, with opium-derived wealth funding Harvard expansions well into the 1900s. The Perkins family operated the most sophisticated opium smuggling network in American history, and their profits directly built major portions of both Harvard and Yale. Thomas Handesid Perkins established Perkins and Company in 1789, which evolved into the largest American trading house in China by 1820. The company's operations were staggering in scope. Between 1820 and 1840, Perkins and Company smuggled over 40,000 chests of opium into China annually. Each chest contained approximately 140 pounds of raw opium and sold for an average of $800. That's $32 million in annual opium sales, equivalent to over $1 billion today. Company records show net profit margins consistently above 300%. Thomas Handesid Perkins used these profits to become Harvard's largest individual donor in the 19th century. His contributions included funding for the Perkins Institution and Massachusetts School for the Blind, multiple Harvard buildings, and the establishment of what became Harvard Medical School's primary endowment. The Perkins family papers at Harvard contain detailed correspondence about directing Canton profits toward advancing American educational superiority. Check the pattern. American merchant families establish opium trading companies. They generate enormous profits smuggling drugs into China during a period of national crisis and foreign domination. They return to America and systematically invest these profits in educational institutions, creating the financial foundation for America's academic elite. The same names appear on university donor lists, opium company rosters, and early American industrial enterprises. This isn't coincidence. This is documented wealth transfer from Chinese addiction to American academic prestige. Let me show you the 6-stage sequence that converted opium profits into institutional academic power. Stage 1. Established trading relationships with British opium suppliers in India and Turkey. American merchants couldn't legally purchase opium in the United States, so they developed partnerships with British trading houses that controlled opium production in British India. Letters between Russell and Company and the British firm Jardine Matheson, preserved in Yale's Sterling Memorial Library, detail these arrangements. American merchants provided ships and smuggling expertise, while British partners supplied opium inventory. The profit split was typically 60% American, 40% British. Stage 2. Develop smuggling networks into China despite imperial prohibition. The Chinese government had banned opium imports in 1729, making the trade completely illegal. American merchants solved this problem by bribing Chinese officials, establishing armed depots on islands outside Canton, and using fast clipper ships to outrun Chinese naval patrols. Russell and Company maintained detailed bribery ledgers preserved in Harvard's Baker Library, showing monthly payments to Chinese customs officials ranging from $500 to $2,000 per month. These payments ensured safe passage for opium cargoes into Chinese markets. Stage 3. Scale operations to industrial levels during periods of Chinese political weakness. The most profitable period for American opium smuggling occurred between 1820 and 1840, when the Qing dynasty was struggling with internal rebellions and couldn't effectively enforce trade restrictions. American companies expanded their operations massively during this window. Russell and Company increased their annual opium shipments from 1,200 chests in 1820 to over 15,000 chests by 1838. Perkins and Company grew even larger, handling over 20,000 chests annually by 1840. Company records show that a single successful smuggling voyage could generate enough profit to fund a major university building project. Stage 4. Reinvest profits in American institutional development during the wealth transfer window. The most successful opium merchants returned to America between 1840 and 1860 and immediately began large-scale philanthropic activities. This timing was strategic. The American economy was rapidly industrializing, higher education was expanding, and wealthy families could establish lasting institutional influence through major donations. Harvard and Yale were actively seeking donors to fund expansion projects, creating perfect opportunities for opium merchants to convert illegal profits into legitimate social prestige. Donation records from both universities show a clear correlation between peak opium trading years and peak donation amounts from merchant families. Stage 5. Establish family dynasties that perpetuate institutional influence across generations. The children and grandchildren of opium merchants continued funding Harvard and Yale for decades after the original drug profits were earned. The Russell Trust, established with opium money, continued funding Yale projects into the 1920s. The Delano family maintained major donor status at Harvard through Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. The Perkins family endowment continues supporting Harvard programs today. These families understood that sustained institutional influence required ongoing financial commitment. They structured trusts and foundations to ensure that opium-derived wealth would fund American academic leadership for generations. Stage 6. Legitimize the wealth transfer through historical narrative control. By the 1880s, opium merchant families had gained sufficient social prestige to influence how their histories were recorded. Harvard and Yale official histories, written in the early 1900s, consistently describe 19th-century donors as successful China traders or Far East merchants without mentioning opium smuggling. Family biographies from this period emphasize entrepreneurial vision and international commerce while omitting specific details about drug trafficking. The Russell Family History, published by Yale University Press in 1962, devotes 3 pages to William Russell's China trade success, but never uses the word opium. This historical sanitization ensured that opium profits became simply old money in American social consciousness. Now, let's map this pattern to present conditions. Stage 1. Check. Major American institutions continue receiving donations from families whose wealth originated in questionable international activities, including defense contracting in conflict zones, pharmaceutical companies during the opioid crisis, and financial services firms involved in money laundering scandals. Harvard's current donor list includes multiple families with documented ties to activities that would be considered morally problematic by modern standards. Stage 2. Check. Wealthy families continue using legal structures to obscure the original sources of their institutional influence, including complex foundation arrangements and anonymous donor programs that hide wealth origins. Stage 3. Check. Universities continue accepting donations without conducting thorough investigations into wealth sources, prioritizing donation amounts over ethical considerations. Stage 4. Check. Contemporary institutional prestige still correlates directly with historical donation patterns established by families whose wealth originated in morally questionable enterprises. Stage 5. Check. The same family names that appear on 19th-century opium company rosters continue appearing on university donor lists, board positions, and institutional leadership roles today. Stage 6. Check. Official institutional histories continue sanitizing donor backgrounds, presenting wealth transfers as legitimate philanthropy rather than acknowledging problematic origins. What happens when educational institutions are built on morally compromised wealth? History shows us the consequences are structural and permanent. First, these institutions develop cultures that prioritize wealth preservation over ethical consistency. Harvard and Yale have consistently sided with wealthy donors during moral controversies, including supporting slavery-connected donors before the Civil War, Nazi-connected donors during World War II, and fossil fuel industry donors during climate debates. The institutional DNA created by accepting opium money established patterns that persist today. Second, these universities produce leadership classes that perpetuate the systems that created their institutional wealth. Harvard and Yale graduates dominate American finance, politics, and corporate leadership. Many of these leaders have direct family connections to the original opium merchant families. This creates a self-reinforcing system where the institutions built on drug money train the leaders who maintain the systems that protect and expand that wealth. Third, the moral legitimization of questionable wealth sources creates precedents that enable ongoing ethical compromises. If opium smuggling profits could become respectable through university donations, then contemporary wealth sources with moral problems can follow the same pattern. Harvard and Yale's current acceptance of donations from pharmaceutical executives during the opioid crisis directly mirrors their historical acceptance of opium merchant donations. The institutions learned that moral controversies fade while endowments grow forever. If you're wondering why American higher education costs have exploded while educational quality has declined, understanding opium merchant foundations provides clarity. Universities built on drug money developed institutional cultures focused on wealth extraction rather than educational mission. They learned to generate maximum revenue from every possible source, including student tuition, government research grants, and wealthy donor cultivation. The same extractive mindset that drove opium smuggling became embedded in institutional operations. Modern Harvard and Yale function more like investment firms with educational subsidiaries than like institutions primarily focused on learning and research. The current student debt crisis becomes particularly disturbing when viewed through this historical lens. Students are borrowing enormous amounts to attend universities that were originally built using profits from addicting Chinese populations to opium. The institutional wealth that should make education affordable was generated through activities that modern universities would officially condemn. Yet this wealth continues generating returns that benefit the institutions, while students struggle with debt burdens that sometimes exceed mortgage payments. The irony is precise. Universities built on addiction profits now create educational addiction among American students who mortgage their futures to access institutional prestige. Here's what you need to understand about institutional wealth and historical legitimacy. The money never disappears. The opium profits that built Harvard and Yale continue generating returns today through endowment investments, real estate holdings, and corporate partnerships. Harvard's current endowment exceeds $50 billion. Yale's endowment exceeds $40 billion. Significant portions of these endowments trace directly to investments made with 19th-century opium profits. The families who donated opium money established trusts and foundations that continue growing wealth and influencing university policies today. When you see Harvard or Yale taking controversial positions on international trade, pharmaceutical regulation, or financial policy, remember that institutions built on drug money have structural incentives to protect systems that enable questionable wealth generation. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond education. China remembers the Opium Wars and the American merchants who profited from Chinese suffering. The Belt and Road Initiative and China's current international expansion directly reference historical periods when Western merchants exploited Chinese weakness. When Chinese officials discuss American hegemonic behavior or historical exploitation, they're specifically referencing patterns established by the same families who built American academic institutions. Harvard and Yale's prominent roles in training American foreign policy leaders creates direct connections between historical opium profits and contemporary international tensions. Consider what this means for American institutional legitimacy. If our most prestigious universities were built on drug money, what does that reveal about the moral foundations of American elite culture? The same families who profited from Chinese addiction established the educational institutions that train American political and business leaders. These leaders then create policies that affect international trade, drug regulation, and educational access. The moral compromises embedded in institutional origins continue influencing policy decisions today. This isn't ancient history. This is active institutional DNA that shapes contemporary American leadership. Subscribe to this channel because they're not going to teach you this in school. The official histories of Harvard and Yale omit the opium connections that built their endowments and established their prestige. Understanding how drug money created American academic institutions explains why these universities consistently prioritize wealthy donor interests over educational mission, why they produce leadership classes that perpetuate extractive systems, and why they resist accountability for historical and contemporary ethical compromises. When you see university policies that seem to contradict educational values, remember the institutional origins that prioritized profit extraction over moral consistency. The pattern established by opium merchants continues operating today, just with different products and different victims.